We are officially on the air.
Great. Do I click start here?
Yeah, so
There we go.
I'll just start. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here. I think we have another 20 seconds, so I'll just give a really brief introduction here. So my name is Bryce with Tradecraft Industries. I'm the founder here. We do co-working for the construction industry. And as part of what we offer to not only our members, but also industry in general, is bringing in professionals to give their sense of and a little bit more detail on goings on in the market, in the industry, things that would be impactful for the construction industry and small business owners in general. So to that end, we've got some pretty incredible world events going on that impact everybody. And so with the coronavirus, we've asked Jennifer Knight-Lang with Cottony Construction Law to host a webinar today that's going to be going over building in a pandemic, the effects of the coronavirus on the economy and your construction business, particularly contract clauses, and what the current events and current situations mean for you, what you can start to do as a business, not only now, but also moving forward in how you're looking at your construction contracts, both as a owner with contractors as well as contractors with subcontractors. So with that, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking time and putting this together. I know there's a lot of relevant information that business owners need in times like this. So with that, we'll take it away, and thank you very much. Oh, for everybody, if you do have some questions here, you can type them in, and I'll be moderating. I'll take a few of those questions, and every once in a while, Jennifer will stop, and we might go into a couple of questions, and then at the end, we'll really take a deeper dive into some of the larger questions that folks have. So with that, Jennifer, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Bryce. So again, my name is Jennifer Knight-Lang. I'm an attorney at Cottony Construction Law. We basically specialize in the construction industry, offering a one-stop shop for all legal needs of construction companies, and that's from subcontractors and smaller contractors to engineers, architects, any of the trades, as well as general contractors. So we're hoping that given these unique circumstances that everyone is going through, that we're able to be here for you to offer you some information for how to navigate. I mean, it's a changing environment every single day. The news is different, and I know your business is probably dealing with a lot. So my hope is that this presentation offers you some strategies and some helpful tidbits as you move forward. And with that, we will get started. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the economic impact of coronavirus, as you're probably already seeing, as well as some key contract provisions to look out for. Now, when I go into the contract provisions, some of this might be things we're learning now through this experience to help in your contracts in the future. So don't be worried if you don't have these provisions in your current contracts. This isn't to scare you. It's just things to learn and things to look out for. So you may want to go through and check your current contracts for these provisions, but we'll get into more detail about that as we go. Firstly, as I'm sure you're all aware, President Trump declared last Friday a national emergency as the number of coronavirus cases and deaths increased. There is now a travel ban to parts of Europe, which was expanded to include the UK and Ireland. And authorities have encouraged social distancing as much as possible, which I'm sure you're already feeling the effects of. That can be anything from maintaining 6 feet between you and another person, or working from home, which is not always possible, I know, for contractors. So one of the biggest economic impacts that we're seeing is, especially since this virus originated in China, is the supply chain impact. And that's everything from potentially pricing impacts, as well as delays, shipping issues. Much of the manufacturing of certain metal products comes from China. And so since they were the hardest hit and the first to be hit, this is going to have a downstream effect. You may already be seeing this. If you're not seeing this yet, this may be delayed by several weeks, maybe even months. But economists are predicting that this is going to have a pretty big effect on supply chains, particularly those that are used in the construction industry. Fortunately, we don't see too much fluctuation in steel, and gas prices are still low, so that is still something to keep an eye on. But one thing that you can do to avoid this impacting you, or at least mitigate the impact, is try to stock up on some supplies if that's possible at this point. Many suppliers' bids stay locked for 30 to 90 days, which might provide a buffer to some of this volatility, but is something to keep an eye on. And you may want to take special measures to prepare and maybe stock up on some supplies that you may need if that's possible. Labor shortages. This is something that we're going to be feeling, especially as the cases increase in the US. Many employers are already requiring employees to work from home. This has become more and more prevalent in the last couple of days, and it's quickly changing. As I'm sure you've noticed, many businesses are temporarily closing. Restaurants in Denver in particular are just doing takeout orders at this point. So those are just a couple of examples. The courts have basically closed to all non-emergency proceedings. So that's affecting my work as well. So as we see more and more things tend to lock down and close, we're hoping that this is just very temporary, but knowing that many contractors don't have the option of working from home, your workforce may be impacted, and this is definitely something to be aware of. When you're thinking about your deadlines, not being optimistic about those deadlines, communicating with others on the project, with your general contractors, with the owners, that you anticipate potential labor effects. You know, if any of your employees get sick, they obviously need to be staying home. And this is it seems that the information at this point is indicating it's a lengthy virus somewhat. 14 days typically is how long they recommend you stay home if you are sick. So again, anticipating this, communicating is always a good policy. So even if you don't have anybody who's sick yet, communicating that you anticipate you may have delays due to labor shortages is a good idea. Now,
Jennifer,
yeah.
Just one thing, we did have one question this morning
Sure.
about the shelter in place.
So,
So what we've seen, what I saw this morning was Boston was the first town to shut down construction projects, and it hasn't happened anywhere else in the nation. But then San Francisco also implemented the shelter in place, I believe, and they specified that service industry or home construction, there were certain, I want to say, exemptions from the shelter in place that they deemed critical activities, and part of the construction industry was within those. But every jurisdiction, every city, every town is taking this a little bit differently. So just wanted to add that a little bit.
yeah, so that's true. And I've also heard that they're doing more lockdown.
Uh-oh. Hey, Jennifer, I think we're getting a little bit of video feed disruption from you.
In Texas, we're into the, and there's really no way around it if that's something that's imposed. Hopefully that doesn't happen in Colorado, and it is different in every jurisdiction at this point. But this is something to anticipate, right? So at this point, to do mitigation, damage control, what you want to be doing is anticipating delays that are going to be outside your control. So, you may, whether it's labor shortages or a lockdown imposed by the government, you are likely going to be delayed. I would be surprised if anybody's projects are not delayed. I did look into what's happening in the UK and Italy. Obviously, lockdowns imposed in China are a different story because they were much stricter. But in Italy, it took several weeks before they realized how serious it was. And construction projects weren't officially halted, but many people voluntarily stopped work. And so they're currently dealing with that right now, and they're in a much stricter lockdown than we are currently. So I'm keeping an eye on that just as potentially what our situation is going to look like 3 weeks from now. But it's kind of one of those situations where we need to be flexible and be able to respond to the situation as it unfolds. So again, with a lockdown or some government imposed restriction that causes you to have to cease work, my recommendation is just to, again, communicate with everyone else, all other parties involved in the project, particularly those you have contracts with, and document what's happening, document that you are unable to do certain work if you're unable to do so. So essentially keeping track day by day, what are the impediments to your progress so that later on you have plenty of evidence to show that the delays were outside your control. Does that help answer the question? Uh-oh, Bryce, I can't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Now I can hear you.
And I think some of your slides later on are going to be getting to that.
That's true. Yeah, we'll deal with how your contract specifically would deal with that when we talk about contract provisions, but it's definitely a concern. I know everybody is worried about that. So other challenges that you may face, I know this is of prime concern to business owners, capital access to cover fluctuations and potentially interruptions in your business. We are providing a handout at the end of this slideshow that will give you a little bit more information where to go, the link to go to look at what the SBA is offering. But at this point, the United States Small Business Administration is offering or planning to offer economic injury disaster loans to provide emergency assistance to small businesses. This is not the only thing available, but it's one thing that has become available. I think they're going to open applications for that soon, and there's information about it on the SBA's coronavirus page. So that's one thing you may want to look into if you know that a business interruption is not going to, if it's something you're not going to be able to cover financially. As we talked about workforce capacity, anticipating that you are going to have some labor shortage, that your employees may not be able to come in, and it's something that's unpredictable. So being ready for that. Enhanced workplace cleaning measures. If you are going into work, the expectation is going to be that you take additional measures to prevent the spread of the infection. So that's extra cleaning, extra sanitizing, wearing gloves, wearing masks, changing market demand. The market's very volatile right now. Being nimble, being flexible to that, and also monitoring constantly as it's changing because it's changing every day. And contingency planning. This is anticipating what's going to happen. And even if it's changing every day, so obviously you can't anticipate everything, but doing your best to plan ahead and to communicate now rather than waiting for something to happen and doing damage control later is, to the extent possible, going to be your best bet. These are some preventative measures that have been issued by the government, by OSHA, by the Equal Opportunity Employment, by CDC. You're supposed to actively encourage sick employees to stay home, obviously, separate sick employees, but we're becoming aware in the last few days that employees or people in general may not necessarily be showing symptoms, even though they have the virus and they are contagious. So I do think at this point, being overly cautious is probably the best policy, maybe not waiting until an employee is showing symptoms to keep them away from close contact with other people, keeping distance between people, maybe only allowing a certain number of people in an enclosed space at one time. For example, if you have one room, maybe only allow 2 to 3 people in that room. If they're going to be too close together, closer than 6 feet, you may want to sort of anticipate that you want to keep people as separated as possible. Encourage washing hands, encourage sanitizing, using hand sanitizer, and showing your customers that you're taking those extra steps is also going to be good. I know that, like, I went to a restaurant about a week ago and I saw that they were taking all kinds of additional measures, and that was really comforting. So that's just an example of what you can bring. OSHA has an entire page dedicated to COVID-19. There's a lot of good information on that page, and it's constantly being updated. But there are a couple of OSHA standards that could apply to protecting your workers, including the personal protective equipment standards, which you're aware of, the general duty to protect your workers from hazards, and the bloodborne pathogen standard. Although that doesn't directly apply because this isn't a bloodborne illness, it does offer some helpful framework for keeping bodily fluids contained, and that could apply to this as well. So it's a good refresher if you want to look back at that. But again, it is a good idea to be checking on the OSHA COVID-19 page because they are offering a lot of helpful resources and a lot of information that's being continuously updated.
Jennifer, just a couple of things that we've done here at Tradecraft that I know other small businesses or building owners could at least take a look at. We just replaced all of our air filters for our rooftop units, and we're continuously running the fans to try and get as many air exchanges as possible to keep the air fresh. And then one of the things that we saw, it's really about keeping your immune system as healthy as possible. So we've put out emergency packets, just free, fresh fruit at the front desk, as well as wiping down and all the things that you said. We're also doing green power smoothies up at the front desk. So trying to get creative with showing people that we care and really trying to keep people healthy, that if they are working, if they're not sick, trying to boost their immune systems as much as possible.
That's a great idea. And kind of on that note as well, some of the advice has been that being outside is also good to prevent the spread. So if you're working in indoor and outdoor space, encouraging workers to go outside frequently throughout the day, or if they don't need to be inside, to be doing what they can outside, is really, I think, helpful in stopping the spread, and also helpful in preventing many employees from being in an enclosed space and breathing each other's air as much as possible. All right, so we're going to get into the key contract provisions. These are, my hope is that the information about these contract provisions doesn't make you more worried, but provide some useful information for you, either to revise your contracts in the future or review them. I encourage you to, on any of your current projects, review your contracts and see what these provisions are for you right now, see how they might be useful to you, and moving forward, potentially including more language that could protect you in the event something like this happens again. So the primary clause that's implicated here is called the force majeure clause. A lot of people also know this as the acts of God provision. While many of these also, force majeure and acts of God are not the same thing. Force majeure is forces beyond your control that are man-made causes, and acts of God refers more to weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, storms that prevent you from working. So a virus could potentially be considered both an act of God or a force majeure, because it is something that, it spreads from person to person, and it's a force of nature that we can't control, but it also is, the spread of it is somewhat man influenced. So it could fall within either one. But a force majeure clause is a clause in your contract that allocates the risk for performance under the contract if it's delayed or stopped due to forces outside of your control. If delivering on your contract becomes impossible, inadvisable, illegal, impractical, this is a clause that anticipates what to do if that happens. And generally provides notice to the parties of the types of events that you're anticipating would cause you to be unable to complete your contract obligations. So the force majeure event, to qualify as force majeure, it must be beyond the control of the parties, cannot be anticipated, foreseeable, or expected, and is unavoidable. That certainly, it seems, applies to COVID-19. But other examples include severe weather events and man-made events, wars, terrorism, explosions, strikes, scarcities. So that's what this type of clause is intended to anticipate. And these are a few examples of what that clause may look like in your contract. These are just, this wording can vary, and not every contract is going to have this, and not every force majeure clause is going to be able to anticipate any possible issue. So I included pandemic or public health emergency in these examples. Just because that's not in your contract doesn't necessarily mean that, that it's not going to be, that COVID-19 isn't going to be something that qualifies as force majeure, but look for language that includes more general issues like forces beyond your control or acts of God, or, if you don't have a specific thing for a public health emergency, maybe it falls within one of the other items listed in your clause. Now, if you don't have a force majeure clause, there is a fallback option if you're unable to deliver on your contract due to forces beyond your control, particularly like we were talking before about a government lockdown or something imposed that makes you completing your work illegal. That would be considered an impossibility, and impossibility is a common law defense to breach of contract. So for example, if you were to be sued later on for not performing under your contract due to COVID-19, but the reason you couldn't do so was because it became illegal, you could assert that it was impossible because it was illegal for you to perform, and that would be a defense to breach of contract. Does anyone have any questions about that? I know that can sometimes be a little bit convoluted. And if you don't have a question right now, we can address it at the end too. So if something comes up, these clauses are pretty long and can seem a little bit intimidating, but it is really important. Yeah.
We did have one question.
Oh, okay, great.
So one of the one question we had is if it is a government lockdown and government mandated, shelter in place kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an exclusion for it does not cover virus, whatever, is that different? Is the government lockdown because of a virus, or are you not able to complete the work because of the government lockdown? Does that make sense?
So I think that could come up in a couple of different scenarios. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's using the virus as to implicate your force majeure clause in the absence of a government lockdown, or if there is a government lockdown. Is that?
I think it's both. How do you distinguish what was the cause that said you cannot work, it is illegal to work, or it is impractical to work?
So I think we can break it down in a couple of ways. First of all, if there is not a government lockdown, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't invoke your force majeure clause. It doesn't have to be illegal necessarily for it to be considered force majeure or an act of God preventing you from performing under your contract or significantly delaying you. So you don't have to necessarily wait for it to be illegal. If we go through the language of these example provisions, it's, for example, the first one, contractor shall not be responsible for loss, damage, or delay caused by circumstances beyond its reasonable control, including but not limited to acts of God, et cetera, et cetera. So if there is no government lockdown, but this pandemic causes loss, damage, or delay, and it's beyond your control, that could invoke this provision, even without it being illegal for you to continue work. So an example of that would be, let's say you're unable to get your materials because you import them from China, your supplier does, and then they can no longer get the materials you need. So you can't complete your project because you can't get materials. It might not necessarily be illegal for you to do work, but you can't because you don't have your materials. That would implicate these clauses, and you could potentially defer the risk of non-performance under your contract because it's impractical, you're unable to do it, it's beyond your control. Now, if it becomes illegal for you to do work based on a lockdown, that's a different scenario that would implicate this clause. So let's say you're able to get your materials and your workers are still healthy, but there's a government lockdown. So it becomes illegal for you to do your work under the contract. Then that would be another scenario that would implicate the force majeure provision. And you would want to go to the other party and essentially communicate, it's now illegal for me to perform under this, and this is contemplated by our force majeure clause. But let's say you don't have a force majeure clause, right? If none of this is in your contract and it becomes illegal for you to do work, and then your general contractor tries to come after you later for non-performance of the contract, you can use the common law defense of impossibility. It was, even in the absence of these provisions in your contract, you can say, I could not perform under the contract because it became illegal due to no fault of my own.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. And we've got a few other questions, but I'd like to let you keep going through the slides, and we'll probably, I think you'll get to a couple of these.
Okay. All right. So when we're talking about force majeure clauses, some things to consider. This means consider these when you're looking at your contracts now to see what your provisions cover, and also in the future, using this experience to make your contracts a little bit better and more protective for you should anything like this happen again in the future, which I hope it doesn't. So things to consider: what events are considered force majeure? So that's, as in the previous slide, there's a whole list that's contemplated by this clause. So looking in your contracts to see what events you're anticipating are force majeure. Who is responsible for suspending performance? That may or may not be delineated in your contract, and it might be shared between the parties as well. Who is allowed to invoke the clause? Again, that may be specified and it may not be, but it's something to consider. Which contractual obligations are covered by the clause? There may be some obligations that you can suspend, and there may be others that are exempt from this. How is the inability to perform determined? So that's something, as we just talked about, has it become illegal? How is your inability to perform occurring? Is it impractical? Is it, are you physically unable to do it, or has it become illegal? What happens if the event continues for an extended time period? And that could be something that happened with COVID-19. We don't know how long it's going to take. Some experts are estimating several weeks up to several months or longer. So obviously the time period, if it's extended, could have a significant impact beyond just suspending work for a couple of weeks and having a little bit of a delay. It could actually have a broader impact on projects. And lastly, does the contract provide for liquidated damages? Liquidated damages are predetermined damages for certain types of non-performance in the contract. So you want to check and see if liquidated damages are in there, because that is something you may be responsible for. For example, if there's liquidated damages for not completing a certain portion of the project, in there, how much you will be responsible for, you're going to want to know that so that you can anticipate that happening. As you revise your contracts in the future, liquidated damages is another thing to consider, potentially not having, if you can, in your negotiations, avoid having that. That would help you, I believe. So, okay. This is what we're talking about in this slide doesn't only apply to surety bonds and insurance claims, but you may want to check with your insurance to see if you have coverage for business interruptions, as well as other coverage that may become relevant. As you're looking at that, again, we recommend that you document. Starting now, moving forward in your projects, you're going to want to keep track of your schedule and everything that's impacting your schedule, especially things that are outside your control. So if you're short-staffed on a particular day, document which day it is and why you're short-staffed, who couldn't come in, why you're unable to meet deadlines. If government lockdowns or safety protocols cause you to have to stop operations on certain days, you want to document why and that it's beyond your control. And while it's likely that we're going to return to normal soon, I hope, having records of how the work was impacted can help with future claims, insurance claims, as well as if there's any litigation that comes up as a result of project delays or non-completion. You're going to want to rely on the documentation of what happened, that you were not able to do certain things because your operations were hindered by many forces that are beyond your control. Price acceleration provisions are another thing to look out for in your contracts. Want to go back and see on your current projects whether or not you have a provision for this. Price acceleration provides that a contractor, roofing contractor is just an example, but any contractor can adjust the contract price to reflect the actual cost of labor and materials. This may come into play, especially if you're importing materials and your supply chains are affected. If your price goes up significantly, a provision like this would help you recoup some of those costs. And it would allow you to support a demand for additional compensation to avoid you having to bear all of the costs and overhead of this disruption.
So we actually did have a question specifically on this.
Okay, great.
And so from what it looks like from the question, I'll just read it to you. How can we protect ourselves if we have a fixed bid contract drawn up now based on current pricing from material price increases that may happen due to supply chain disruptions? There is no act of God clause in the already signed contract.
Okay, so if this provision, like the example at the bottom of the slide, if this were in your contract, you could rely on it to then increase your price. If you don't have a clause like this in your contract, you may not have as much to rely on to help you with that. It's something that you're going to want to consider in your future bids, knowing that, anticipating supply chain disruptions as you make bids, you may want to increase them or adjust to account for a potential spike in your costs. And including a provision like this would be really helpful in the future, moving forward. With that particular situation, without anything in your contract, you may not be able to recoup the costs. You could communicate with all parties involved, and in this unique situation, request that they share in the burden, especially if it's a very significant uptick. Unfortunately, without a provision, it's not as clean. So the process isn't laid out for you. But if it's going to be a significant cost, then you may consider requesting that the customer share in the additional cost, and maybe, don't point out that it's not in your contract, but it's possible that they would do that because these are extenuating circumstances. Another thing to consider is something called efficient breach. While it's not recommended to breach your contract, if you cannot deliver on it because of the cost, then, as I mentioned before, there is a common law impossibility. So if it becomes impossible for you to do it based on the increase in cost, that's something you could potentially rely on. But it does expose you to some risk if you decide to breach it.
Is there anything with common law with unjust enrichment that you might be able to draw on?
Unjust enrichment would be after the work is completed. Unjust enrichment is when you have done the work and you haven't been paid for it. So the party who has enjoyed the benefits of your work without paying you would be unjustly enriched.
Okay.
So that's only going to come into play, let's say like a downstream scenario of this is maybe a customer doesn't pay you because they've been affected, like a general contractor or the owner of a project has been financially impacted by this virus through their operations, and then they don't pay you for work that you actually completed. You can make an unjust enrichment claim against that party for essentially taking the benefit of your labor and your materials and not compensating for.
Okay.
Any other questions on this one?
No, for that specific question, I know from experience as a general contractor, the business relationship that I have with my subcontractors, I want to keep them in business and I want to work with them. So I think it's really just about effectively communicating while protecting yourself. This is what we're encountering, and how can we all work together in order to make sure we can still perform on the contract, get the project done, really project first on that. comes across pretty well, depending on the business relationship that you have. When just relying on the contract provisions and the law, it's kind of a last case scenario that you want to go, but it's kind of what I've seen as a GC.
I think that's definitely going to come into play here, especially because this is affecting everyone. I think communication early and often is going to be the best policy. And like you're saying, to preserve the business relationships and being understanding during this time is going to go a long way.
Yeah.
And one thing I would recommend to you with that is communicate in writing as well, so that it goes towards your efforts to document what's happening. Even if you just have a conversation in person, following up with an email summarizing what you talked about is helpful, because you can then go back and say, look, here are the efforts I went to communicate early and often what challenges I was facing, and to try to accommodate everyone involved to the best extent possible given the circumstances. It is affecting everyone, and so I think if people can collaborate and band together during this time, as opposed to aggressively going after one another, it's certainly going to be a better situation. You know, it's really unique thing that hasn't been encountered before. And so I think that leniency is important on all sides.
Agreed.
All right. So lastly, we have the no damages for delay provision. This is somewhat included in some of the force majeure examples because we included delay as well as non-performance in that, but this is specifically dealing with just damages for delay. This allows the contractor additional time, not compensation, as a result of delays beyond their control. So this is just like getting a time extension on whatever your predetermined deadline is. And at the bottom of the slide here, we have an example of a provision like this. If you have this in one of your contracts, it's one to raise with your prime contractor to ask for additional time. And maybe if you don't know exactly how much time you're going to need, because so much of this is up in the air as the situation unfolds, you may just want to point this out and anticipate that there will be delays, and just delineate that you're, not having compensation damages for those delays, but that everyone can be understanding of the time needed to complete the project given the extenuating circumstances.
One thing to add, as a subcontractor, actually a contractor in general, if you do notify whoever your contract is with, basically a date of this is when it started, this is the point of impact, and sort of name what that was. If it was mandating stopping, if it was, would you recommend saying from this point, this is when we're impacted, or is it best just to leave that open and document all the way and let the courts, let insurance, let whoever it is really decide when that effective date was?
So I think this goes to documenting. Document as soon as you start being impacted, and even anticipating impacts. So each day that goes by, as you're anticipating things happening, document to the best of your ability that you think it's going to cause delays, that it is causing delays, what's causing the delay, how is it causing a delay, and how it's beyond your control. So that later on, you can use it to prove. It's less important when the date actually is, but I think starting now, I would recommend everybody start documenting anything you think is causing you a delay or that might cause you a delay. And start looking ahead, look into what you're ordering, look into what deadlines you have coming up, and start trying to extend those and start anticipating that you are going to need to delay, and document the reasons for that, so that, again, it's clear what was beyond your control and what the delays were caused by. And it's much harder for other parties to be, strictly putting all the risk on you if you are each step of the way making your best efforts and documenting that, and you can prove your delays were caused by things you have no control over through no fault of your own, and things that you could not have anticipated in your contract, especially if you don't have a provision like this. You could be communicating and asking for this relief based on what you have evidence for. So, each day on your projects, take stock of what's going on and what obstacles you think you're going to have.
Yeah, one thing to add to that too, we had one of our members tell us here this morning they were about to start a pretty labor-intensive project, and he was thinking about doing a slight price decrease, say like 5%, but then requiring more of a deposit. So asking for 30, 40, 50% of the money up front, but offering a little bit of a discount, or starting to look in their terms for payment where it's, maybe it's not monthly, maybe it's every 2 weeks or something. That's the larger the project, the more difficult that's going to be. But for some of the smaller contractors out there, I think having some of those, again, early, open and often communication of staying up on your materials delivered on site, staying up on wages for workers so that you're not having to carry these things for 90, 120 days as much as possible.
Yeah,
that was a little bit of a sidetrack from this slide, but.
Well, and I was going to mention too, if you don't have a price acceleration provision, and it's not like for roofing contractors, that's not always an option, you might consider bulk buying some materials that you think you're going to need so that you don't have to deal with as much spiking. So kind of pre-ordering and stocking up, kind of like people are doing with groceries.
Toilet paper.
Which I don't understand, but
I don't know that anybody does.
Anyway, doing that can kind of help insulate you from some of the volatility if it's something you can do. So to your point, Bryce, if you're requiring a little bit more payment up front, maybe you can use that to order a little bit more of the materials you think you're going to need so that you have a little extra to tide you over if there's a price spike or if there's a delay in delivery in the future.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. We covered a lot, and I want to reiterate that this is not to create more worries for you. If you don't have some of these things in your contracts, it's things to think about to put in the future. And there are some ways around it, like the common law protections I mentioned, and communicating and documenting that will also go a long way during this time if you don't have some of these contractual protections in place. And also, we at Cotney are happy to help you with anything really specific that you're encountering during this time.
One other thing I wanted to highlight. So I just sent out the flyer that we made, the informational flyer.
Yes.
And one of the things on there is the SBA emergency protection. So if anybody here that's on the webinar, or if you see this later, has any questions specifically with that, I'm reaching out on behalf of Tradecraft and all of our members. I'm really reaching out and starting to make those inroads as far as what is a checklist for a small business owner that they need to have in place in order to in order to start looking at that. So the current rates that I had seen was about 3.75% for some of these loans, and some of them up to, I think, about 2 million. So there's a lot of government money that is coming. We don't know exactly when or how, I think, or what their criteria is for distribution. So restaurants and bars are probably much heavier hit right now than contractors. So I don't know if they weight that a little bit. But as people have questions, please reach out to either Jennifer or myself, and we can put you in contact with either somebody at the SBA or loan officers that are having those conversations and getting those things teed up. One of the big things that Tradecraft, as well as if you're a prime contractor, if you're a general contractor, you want to help your vendors, not your vendors, but your subcontractors. You want to keep these guys in business in order to be able to perform work as we get through this, as we all get through this, as well as keep them in business for the future and to strengthen that business relationship. So the more that as a GC or a prime, the more resources that you have available to help your subs out during this time, they're going to remember that. And it will ultimately come back to you. I believe in karma, but I also believe in good business. So just heads up on that. If anybody has any questions, reach out to myself, or Jennifer's contact is on here, but she can refer you to me as well.
Definitely. And I know that we were talking about potentially putting together some follow-up content on this. I know that a couple of others at Cotney are interested in putting together another follow-up presentation more focused on the employment law aspects of this situation. So getting more into detail with OSHA, FLSA, ADA, how to handle your own employees. So that may be something that we can put together if it's helpful to you. And yeah, also the financial, as you're mentioning, helping connect people with bankers and the government resources available. The flyer also just has links to information pages that are continuously being updated. So those are good places to check. And there are also a lot of resources on there, like templates for what to post at your work site, checklists or things to consider as you're encountering different obstacles moving forward, and financial resources, planning resources. And a lot of it is just general for any business, but some is specific to this industry, OSHA in particular. So hopefully those you'll find helpful as well.
Yeah, we did have a couple of folks here with questions, mostly about, so the webinar will be posted. So Tradecraft has our YouTube channel. So we're going to be continuously adding to that content. So I will send out the link from there. We had one question, are we going to make the slides available? I don't know, Jennifer, what do you think? Can we distribute those? Is that?
I think we can make the slides available. I will double check, but I think we can make them available. And posting this as a video on YouTube is also another way you can refer back to certain slides. But I know for the sample contract provisions, you may want to have the word for word. So I will double check, but we can hopefully post that along with it, maybe in the notes to the YouTube video, or distribute it however is best for you through Tradecraft. Great.
And then we did have one follow-up. They would be very interested in the personnel and the financial follow-up. So I think what we'll do from this is, if you go back to Cotney, kind of see what we can post. I'll also be checking around to see if we can do some of the financial. I'd really like to get somebody from the Denver or regional small business administration. So somebody from the SBA, once they have those guidelines, somebody from that, and then probably the banking industry to go over some of those things. So yeah, everybody that's on here, please share this as it comes out on the YouTube channel, and let us know what else we can be as far as a resource, whether that's insurance, whether it's bonding, personnel. There's a lot out there. And what Tradecraft is trying to do right now is to provide constructive resources. So, it's uncertain times. It's even more uncertain if all you're doing is checking the news and, seeing all of the doom and gloom that's out there. And there's certainly a lot of it. I think that as business owners, as we're looking towards, how can we use these really trying times as an opportunity to work on our business, on, just step by step getting better and taking care of our employees and our jobs. I think it's going to keep all of us a lot more sane as we go through the next 2, 3, 4 months in general in this.
Definitely. I think this is an opportunity to come together. And I know we at Cotney and also at Tradecraft look at this as an opportunity to be there for you. So as things are coming up, please do let us know what other content you want to see, what information we could provide that will be helpful for you right now as we're navigating this challenging time, which I think it is an opportunity to work on your business and to come out on the other side stronger. So that's my hope for all of you.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good slide to end on. So everybody, thank you very much, and be looking for the as we post this up on the YouTube channel. So Jennifer, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to go over this stuff with us.
Thank you, Bryce. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Stay healthy.